Regardless of your thoughts on the series as a whole, I think we can all agree that Zelda 2 is on average the most disliked game in the series. Sure, Skyward Sword and Tears of the Kingdom haters are louder overall, but there are also plenty of people who still love both of them. Most fans of Zelda 2 in my experience only like it in the context of it being an NES classic, as opposed to in the context of being the second game in one of the most beloved franchises in history, and it's not difficult to see why. On the surface, this game is a black sheep. It's far more linear than either of the games surrounding it, it's easily the most difficult game in the series, it primarily uses a perspective that no other game in the series does, it's the only game in the series to not have bombs or rupees, it has experience in stat mechanics, it has random encounters, it has a live system, and it uses a spell system instead of equipable items. There are a lot of rather unorthodox things in this game, and a lot of people treat it like it was this weird sidestep that's relatively unimportant to the series because of it. But while I understand, I don't necessarily agree. The way that items are utilized in this game is certainly a departure. In the first game, each item that you picked up was a mix between a passive upgrade or an item that you actively had to equip to use. Even the passive ones had different effects on the gameplay. In this game, every single item is effectively passive, and for the most part they're not really used in any particularly interesting way. All of the items, apart from the glove, all act the same way the raft did in the first game, mostly just being a way to prevent the player from doing the later dungeons early. The glove does have a slightly more active role since it lets you break these blocks inside of dungeons, but it's really the only example of the game ever being designed around the player actively using an item outside of the overworld. Generally speaking, I don't like when required items are nothing more than passive upgrades, especially when the only meaningful thing they do is lock the player from the next dungeon, and that's basically all the items in this game do. Zelda 2 is far more linear than the first game, and because of that it lacks that sequence-breaking aspect that makes the original so great. In that game, you could do a lot of things out of order as long as you knew what you were doing. It challenged the player to learn the level design and how the mechanics worked with a reward of obtaining the best items earlier than usual. That aspect really isn't in the sequel. I mean, you can technically do the first dungeon whenever you want since all its item does is light up caves, but there's really not a point to doing it since there's nothing in the first dungeon that's made easier or more convenient by doing it later. It feels less like a designed option and more like something the developers didn't think anyone would be stupid enough to try, so they didn't bother stopping you. You could also get the downstab before Dungeon 2 if you go through Death Mountain first, and that's kind of helpful, but not really enough for it to matter. The magic key is especially disappointing. In the first game, it was an optional item that made every dungeon significantly easier, and it was made even better once you realized how early you could get it. Here, you can't even reach it until you get the item out of the 5th dungeon, and at that point there's only one more dungeon with locked doors, and that dungeon doesn't even have any keys in it. The magic key goes from being one of the best items in the first game to yet another item whose only purpose is to lock you out of the next dungeon in the second. That being said, while this linearity does make the act of navigating significantly less exciting than the first game, I'd be lying if I said that it ruins my enjoyment of the game. Yeah, I tend to prefer when the games are open-ended, but it never becomes actively tedious or unfun as a direct result of it being so linear. If anything, the fact that you can't do the dungeons out of order in any real capacity allows for the developers to control the experience in a way that makes its mechanics easier to understand. For example, the first dungeon is relatively simplistic. There are only a handful of branching paths, the keys are easy to find, and the only spell you have easy access to at this point is the shield spell. Even if you did have some of the later spells at this point, none of them would really help you. It sounds lame, but for a first-time player it's still a challenge since they have to get used to the way the game's mechanics work, and there's a lot to get used to. The magic system, the level-up system, the new combat, all of it is far more complex than any individual mechanic in the first game. But for that first dungeon, the only spell the player has to worry about conserving magic for is the shield spell, and the experience needed to get the first few level-ups is relatively low. Even the enemies start out pretty easy, only for the dungeon to introduce the first Iron Knuckle fight towards the end. By the time you get to the second dungeon, you have access to 3 more spells in the downstab, so the level design in combat gets a little more complex. The game eases the player into its mechanics in a way that it would never be able to if the player had a choice in which dungeon to attempt first, and because of that I find Zelda 2's dungeon design in general is far more intuitive than the first game. I love the original game to death, but I can't deny that its dungeons aren't exactly the friendliest towards newcomers. Sure, once you figure out how they work they can be pretty exciting, but any first-time player is practically guaranteed to look up a map if they don't want to spend months bombing every single wall. On top of this, the content within the dungeons themselves almost never evolves beyond obtaining the stepladder. In Zelda 2, the dungeons are constantly adding new room layouts and even mechanics that give challenges in platforming and combat. But while these layouts can be challenging, they're not so absurdly obscure that you'd never know how to progress. The worst it ever gets is the fake wall in Dungeon 5, but even that is hinted at by one of the NPCs. Zelda 2's more linear structure has its benefits. That alone makes me appreciate it more than the games that try too hard to be as open as possible with none of the nuance of the first game, and despite being more linear, there's still a ton of player agency in Zelda 2. This is the first Zelda with a magic meter in it, and I personally think it's the best implementation of it in the entire series. In the other games it's in, it tends to feel like an afterthought. A few items occasionally use it effectively, but it's a system that only sometimes feels like it's being utilized. In Zelda 2, all of the abilities that you have to actively use are now spells, each with their own cost. Each one of the squares of magic are worth 16 points, and each spell costs a certain amount of points to cast. Unlike other Zeldas, the Adventure of Link actively displays the casting cost for each of the spells because your ability to progress through the dungeon is directly tied to how well you manage your magic. Your spells are quite useful in this game. The shield spell halves all damage taken, the life spell restores your health, the jump spell does exactly what it sounds like it does, the fairy spell turns you into a fairy that can fly across the entire screen, letting you get to places that you wouldn't be able to otherwise or even skip past tough sections of the game, and that's it. Yeah, the last 4 spells kinda stink. Fire is completely useless. I always thought that it would have been neat if it temporarily doubled your attack the same way the shield spell temporarily doubles your defense, but no, all it does is make your sword shoot a fireball that will kill 2 specific easily avoidable enemies and nothing else. Reflect is required for one boss and is kind of helpful for fighting the less easily avoidable racists, but it's never useful outside of those 2 specific circumstances. The spell will open up a single cave in New Kasuto Town and turn weak enemies into even weaker enemies, but that's it. Thunder will kill all the enemies on the screen, which sounds good, but the magic cost is almost never worth it, so its only real use is exposing the penultimate boss's weak point. It's a bit of a shame that the later spells leave a bit to be desired, because otherwise the game does an excellent job of balancing them. Magic refills are scarce in this game. It's not like every other Zelda where every single thing will drop magic for you. In this game you really have to make an effort to conserve your magic and plan ahead. Enemies can drop the occasional magic refill, but it's rare enough that you can never fully rely on it. There are refills hidden in statues around each of the palaces, but not only do you have to remember which ones, but there's even some risk in checking them since they can spawn a red iron knuckle instead. Suddenly, it makes sense that the game goes out of its way to tell you the cost for each spell, because that little bit of magic you have runs out very quickly. Sure, you might have a lot of magic now, but you still have quite a bit of the palace left to go, and there are a lot of tough enemies that you'll need to fight to get to the end. You could use the shield spell in every room to conserve your health, but that will eat up your magic, so it might be a better idea to only use it in rooms with enemies that you personally struggle with. Of course, if you're confident enough in your combat abilities, you could also just forego using the shield spell for most of the game and focus on saving your magic for when you really need it, because you will need it. There are points dotted around the game after the first dungeon where you're required to use a spell to progress, usually either jump or fairy. Sometimes the game will give you a magic jar just before this, but often you're going to be left with whatever amount of magic you have left. At that point, your only options are to hope that a nearby enemy will drop magic, or... The lives mechanic is a bit of a point of contention when it comes to Zelda 2. In any other Zelda, when you die, you always respawn somewhere relatively close by, usually at the beginning of whatever dungeon you were in or the last load zone you went through. Zelda 2 isn't like that. Instead, you start out with 3 lives. Now if you die, you respawn at the beginning of whatever room you died in. If you lose all of your lives, however, you respawn all the way back at the beginning of the game. This is probably one of the most universally disliked aspects of Zelda 2. The tedium of having to make the trek all the way back to wherever you were when you've got the game over is something that even die-hard fans of this game tend to admit kinda sucks, and while I agree, I also think that it's really not that big of a deal. I've seen so many people say that the simple fact that you don't respawn at the beginning of each dungeon when you get a game over is the biggest reason why this is the worst Zelda or whatever, but come on. The overworld is designed to be as easy to backtrack as possible. It takes all of 2 minutes to get back to wherever you were. Heck, it takes more time to do literally anything in Breath of the Wild. Yeah, I would prefer it if I could respawn at the beginning of each dungeon, but the fact that I don't is a mild annoyance at worst. On the contrary, the way that lives work in Zelda 2 allows for even more player choice and resource management. Dying is a valid tactic in this game. Sometimes you'll come to a point where you can't progress without magic, or where you're about to come up against a fight that would be significantly easier if you could just cast jump. Every time you die, your magic is completely refilled, so if you're completely out, then you can easily find a pit somewhere and throw yourself off of it. But you have to be rather conservative about doing that because you only have 3 lives to start with, and not only are you sent back to the starting area on a death, but you'll lose any unspent experience points that you still have. Your lives become yet another resource for you to strategically use. Sure, burning 1 life might not be a big deal, but are you really willing to use the second one? There are also a handful of 1-ups lying around in the form of that one unsold Link doll every time I walk into a Books A Million. Sometimes getting them can be dangerous, so you have to choose between skipping it over and not having enough lives, or trying to get it and risking the lives you do have. On top of that, they don't respawn, so you have to be careful about when you pick them up. Do you pick it up when you're down to 1 life and just need that second wind, or do you pick it up on your next attempt when you still have 2 lives and want to guarantee your success? The way lives and magic work in Zelda 2 is very reminiscent of the way the first game handles juggling its various resources, only this time you're focused on managing a single resource to the best of your ability. If that's not enough for you, then Zelda 2 is an action RPG too. There are 3 stats in this game. Attack increases the damage of your sword, life increases your defense, and magic decreases the cost of each spell. The game itself doesn't do a good job of explaining this outside of the manual, but these stats are all increased independently of one another. Each stat has different experience requirements. Life costs the lowest, attack costs the highest, and magic is somewhere in between. When you get enough experience to level up a stat, the game pulls up a menu and lets you decide whether you want to increase that stat or save your experience so you can level up the next stat instead. This might be my favorite aspect of Zelda 2. In other RPGs, especially around this time period, your stats never felt like they required much thought on your part. At most, you could choose whether or not to grind up enough money to buy a specific piece of equipment, but that was really it. In Zelda 2, leveling up is a deliberate choice. Sure, you can level up your stats in order, or if you're a beginner you could prioritize health so you can have an easier time getting used to the combat, or maybe magic so you can have an easier time figuring out how to use the spells to your advantage. Not to mention, leveling up either of those stats will refill their respective meters, so it's not a bad idea to hold off on leveling them up until you get just enough experience for the next stat, just in case it happens at a more opportune time. Of course, the best strategy in this game is to prioritize attack and defeat enemies quickly, but not only do you have to be relatively comfortable with the game's combat in order to even get a hit in on the enemy before they can hit you, you also have to take a risk in doing so by deliberately choosing to level up the most expensive stat, which means that you'll be leveling up less frequently. Luckily, there are ways of maximizing the amount of experience you get. Obviously, you could sit around and grind enemies, but certain enemies will also drop bonus experience for every 6 you kill, the stronger ones giving you bags with 200 points in them. The real way to maximize your level ups are in dungeons, though. After you kill each boss, you place a crystal in the statue in the room after, which will then immediately give you enough experience to reach the next level, no matter how high it is. That's 6 free level ups given to you throughout the game that you could plan around. Knowing this, you could deliberately cancel your level ups to maximize the amount of free experience you get. An experienced player can get all the way to level 4 attack before even leaving the first dungeon. You can even use the same trick to level up your other stats multiple times by gaining enough experience to level up the most costly stat but choosing to level up the cheaper ones instead. Something I accidentally messed up doing while recording, but hey, at least I got an extra life out of it. The thing is, this is also another risky decision to make. If you get a game over while trying to conserve your experience, it all goes away and you're back to square one. This isn't too big of a deal in the early game where your lesser stats cost no more than 100 experience to level up, but in the late game these stats have costs that are in the thousands. If you pass the experience threshold for your lesser stats but then get a game over while fighting Karok, you've now lost all of your experience. Now you're potentially behind on experience and have to grind to make it back up. It sucks, but that's the risk you took, and quite the risk it is. Zelda 2 is pretty well known for being the hardest game in the series, and while I do agree that it's the most challenging Zelda, I also think that challenge is far more manageable than people give it credit for. Mostly. For the most part, the combat in this game is a lot of fun. I enjoy the rather stiff combat of the first game, but I can't deny that Zelda 2's combat feels a lot more dynamic and fast-paced. There's a lot of emphasis on spacing in this game. Your sword is really short, which a lot of people dislike, but I think it adds a neat challenge since you have to be really careful about getting close. You can't just stab them from afar, you have to wait for an opening, and that opening can be pretty tight. Verticality also plays a huge role. Some enemies jump or fly, some of them attack high and low, some of them can only be hit on certain elevations, and some of them are all of the above. Your shield can only cover part of your body, so you have to juggle both attacking and defending it at different elevations. It feels overwhelming at first, but once you get the hang of it, it's incredibly satisfying to block a chain of attacks or to hit an enemy multiple times before they even have a chance to hit you. You even get new attacking moves, the up and down stabs, helping you deal with enemies with awkward positioning and attack patterns. The down stab even has a bounce, which is really fun to use to your advantage. There are some pretty major flaws, however. For starters, the enemy placement in this game is notably unfair at times. Even in the very first dungeon, there are rooms with multiple enemies that are borderline impossible to not get hit by at least once. Sometimes you have enemies in enclosed areas so it's impossible to jump to avoid attacks, sometimes they infinitely spawn on either side, sometimes they're positioned in a way where it's way too easy to be knocked into a pit and instantly die. I don't personally struggle with these all too much, but it's never fun when stuff like this happens. The real issue, however, is with shielded enemies. Towards the end of the first dungeon you run into your first Iron Knuckle. Iron Knuckles, along with Lizalfos and a handful of other enemies, have shields that can move up and down to block your attacks. On paper, this is a really cool gimmick, an enemy that changes its weak point so you have to adapt while it attacks you. There is one major flaw though, namely that these enemies change the position of their shields instantly. You have no way of knowing for certain where their shield is going to be when you attack, because even if you do attack the part of their body where they aren't shielding, they can and will change position before your sword even gets a chance to connect. It takes any and all skill out of the fight and just devolves everything to frantic button mashing, the entire time hoping that you happen to kill them before they hit you too many times. It wouldn't even be so bad if they only appeared every once in a while, but you have to fight Iron Knuckles in every single dungeon, sometimes multiple times per room. Once you get to the eastern continent, Lizalfos start appearing in the overworld and they have the exact same problem. Luckily, there is a way to cheese them. You see that little gap in elevation between the top of the Iron Knuckle and the top of their shield? Well, it turns out that your sword can actually hit enemies through that if it's at the right elevation, so by jumping and attacking while crouching, you can attack their forehead. This is not intended at all, at least not to my knowledge, but at the same time it does take a decent amount of skill to pull off and also leaves you vulnerable to attack if you can. It actually kind of leaves me with conflicting opinions. On one hand, fighting these enemies in the intended way is abysmal. On the other hand, the jumping crouch stab method is accidentally really neat and fits with the rest of the combat too. This really only applies to Iron Knuckles and Lizalfos though. Once you get to the Great Palace, you have to deal with Fakos, which are the exact same as Iron Knuckles but with a key difference that they can jump, and wouldn't you know it, Link happens to share the exact same weakness as the shielded enemies. Fighting these guys is a complete lost cause. It ends up being easier to just run past them, even if it means slowly trudging through a giant waffle while it takes pot shots at you. The final boss is no better. I really like Shadow Link in concept, but man, he is not a fun fight at all. There's certainly an intended and skillful way to fight him, but getting a single hit in on him feels so inconsistent that I just default to the cheese method of crouching in the corner and stabbing when he gets too close. It sucks, because otherwise I really like the Great Palace. I like the layout, I like the way that the individual rooms are designed, I really like fighting the penultimate boss right before Shadow Link, but the final boss itself is unfortunately a really lame ending to an otherwise great game. Zelda 2 is certainly different in a lot of ways. That was Miyamoto's goal when developing it after all, but I think a lot of people tend to focus too much on these differences when discussing the game and not its similarities. Yeah, Zelda 2 is primarily a side-scroller with random encounters and a level-up system, but at the same time it's still a game where your progression is locked by items found within labyrinthine dungeons that you need to complete before unlocking the final challenge. If anything, I would argue that their insistence on reusing the same structure just solidifies what Zelda is at its core, and any other aspect of the first game not present in this one wasn't important enough to keep. After all, it's not like this is the only game in the series that doesn't use a top-down perspective. It's also not the only game in the series where traversing the overworld takes a form that's fundamentally different from the rest of the game, or where the gameplay revolves around the use of a stat system. Zelda 2 is not one of the best Zeldas, not even close. But in spite of its flaws, I do think it's one of the better games in the series, and I don't think calling it the Black Sheep does it justice. It's still very much a proper sequel to The Legend of Zelda, a sequel that takes the core design of the first game and warps it around something new. It uses its difference to highlight its similarities. A series is at its best when it spins the same formula in new and exciting ways, with mechanics that let us explore the base concept through a lens that we never could before. Zelda 2 isn't identical to the first game, but it is everything a sequel should be.